everyone. I'm Micaela Parker, a founder and executive director for the Academic Data Science Alliance, now rebranding to the Alliance for Data Science and AI, still ADSA. I'm here to welcome you to our side chat series where we play with the fireside chat concept, adapting it for the season. So today you can see we are pumpkin side. And my guests are here to talk about collaboration that spawned from a working group in ADSA examining metrics for data science faculty hiring, retention, promotion, and tenure. So let me start by introducing my guests today. Drew Casey is the Associate Director for Program Engagement at the Texas A&M Institute of Data Science, or TAMIDS. His role is to increase TAMIDS's impact by connecting participants' capabilities and activities across programs, and by identifying and developing new research and education opportunities for students, faculty, and partner organizations. And for the purposes of this talk session, Pumpkin Side Chat, he was a very engaged member of our working group and will provide that perspective today. Erin McKiernan is the Director of Programs and Strategies at the Open Research Community Accelerator, or ORCA. Erin is a prominent open science advocate and practitioner. She previously served as the community manager for the Open Funders Research Group, ORFG. Erin is also a neurophysiologist who has been a professor in the Department of Physics, Biomedical Physics program at the National Autonomous University of Mexico in Mexico City since 2015. And finally, Greg Tannenbaum is the Executive Director of ORCA, as if you couldn't tell from his background image. Greg has had founding and senior leadership roles with the Open Research Funders Group, the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine's Roundtable on aligning incentives for open scholarship, the Higher Education Leadership Initiative for Open Scholarship, or HELIOS, the Alliance for Open Scholarship, All for OS, and Berkeley Electronic Press. So welcome all of you, and thank you for joining us. I believe we're going to start with an intro to ORCA from Greg. So Greg, why don't you take us away?
Sure thing. And thanks everyone for making the time to be here with us. We're really delighted to have this conversation and particularly pleased to be in this ongoing partnership with ADSA, which has been really rewarding for us, certainly. As Micaela alluded to, Erin and I co-run ORCA, the Open Research Community Accelerator. We're a nonprofit that works with communities to make science more engaging, accessible, and actionable. And we have a specific interest in nurturing cross-sector coalitions to tackle some of the systems level challenges that are impeding the adoption of a more open form of science at scale. One of those challenges definitely at the top of the list or near the top of the list is how we reward open and engaging activities. If we want our scientists and our researchers and our scholars to practice their work in a more open manner, we have to reward them for it. And to that end, we recognize that this is really a multi-actor problem. We're pushing at it from multiple angles simultaneously. So we currently have something called the MA3 Challenge in flight, which is inviting proposals from US-based colleges and universities, including their departments, centers, and institutes, to reimagine their academic hiring, review, promotion, and tenure processes. And there's $1.5 million in funding to support bold and creative strategies to develop academic reward systems that foster a more collaborative and responsive and transparent research environment. Complementary to that, we know that professional societies and associations really play a critical role in identifying and articulating and socializing appropriate open science norms within their disciplines. And so we're collaborating with organizations like ADSA to tailor field-specific guidance on good open science practices and to implement these across departments that are ready for change. And to talk about what that looks like in practice, I'm going to pass it over to Erin.
Thanks, Greg. So as Greg said, we're really interested in, tackling some of these systemic barriers to change. And one of those big barriers is incentives. So we've been working a lot on that and thinking particularly about values-based incentives, which is what brings us here today. So a few years ago, we started a series of workshops. We were interested in talking to academics about how they thought about academic incentives and particularly how we might rethink the academic incentive systems or criteria that we have to better align our values with what we're actually rewarding and evaluating with respect to things like hiring and promotion and tenure. So we did this at first by kind of going to different, as Greg said, we're interested with looking at professional societies, talking to folks who are on the ground, so to speak, and actually seeing these things in their daily academic lives. So we started doing workshops with a few different professional societies, a few different disciplines, talking to faculty and sketching out some of the values, first of all, that they thought were important to their particular discipline. So that can include things like quality or openness or transparency or rigor or reproducibility, all of those great words that are often touted in as well in our own university mission statements, thinking about those values and how we might recognize and incentivize those values. So what are some of the behavioral indicators we could look at? What are some of the scholarly outputs? And very much thinking, we need to go beyond papers. Papers is not the only thing, the only output we're interested in, but also go beyond just looking at sheer number of products and quantity of things like articles or citations, and looking at the broader suite of behaviors that faculty are engaged in. So in doing this, in these consultations, we slowly start to build up this framework that we hoped that folks could use as a tool if they were interested in realigning their values with their incentives and potentially undertaking some reform efforts at their own institutions. The first step in this is that we built this framework, and I'll share a couple links in the chat. Through the Open Science Framework, the OSF page, you can find our framework itself. And through a journal, a new publication platform called MetaRoar, you can see reviews of the preprint. So you can see what other academics are thinking about this framework. So this framework has 14 values, and that's not meant to be, exhaustive, but it was these 14 values that were identified by the faculty we talked to as being, important for them in their disciplines. And 14 values that include, as I mentioned, some of these things like transparency, rigor, quality, et cetera. And considerations, scoping considerations, are we thinking about quality of teaching? Are we thinking about quality of research? Are we thinking about other types of quality or other types of openness and transparency in different facets of their work? And then instead of looking at metrics, which we know is a common thing in our current evaluation systems, again, we wanted to focus on behavioral indicators. So what are the behaviors we'd actually like to index on and we'd like to look for in faculty evaluations? So that was the idea. We built this overall framework, but it's still to a certain extent abstract, right? It's a tool that we hope will make this idea of values-based assessment more concrete, but it's not yet maybe as granular as it could be or as discipline specific as it could be. And this is where the work with ADSA really comes in. So what we wanted to do was form a working group that was going to look at, can we take this framework and now construct a more granular, a more specific version of this tool that is specific to data science. So if you're a data scientist, what does this tool look like? How would we need to tweak it to make sure that it fits the kind of norms and needs of your discipline? So that was what we were trying to do with the working group. We got the working group together. Very thankful to ADSA for their support. Very thankful to all of the faculty, including Drew, that were participating in this. This is all volunteer time, so we're grateful for everyone's kind of engagement and feedback throughout this process. And it was great. We got the group together. We had multiple discussions about why is values-based assessment important? Why might we want to do this? How does it help us as a discipline, as a university, as a department to think about assessment in these ways? And then we really drilled down on the language. So we took 4 or 5 values that the group voted on that they said were most important to them. Things again like reproducibility. And we walked through the language that we had for that. And then we started iterating over that language and saying, okay, if you're a data scientist, what are the things here that resonate? What are the things that don't resonate? What are some of the maybe behaviors or even scholarly outputs that you think should be included here in some explicit way? And this was a group process, right? So we had discussions about it together in real time. We also had asynchronous work where folks were going over the language and refining it. And then finally, and you'll see we have links to these documents where you can go through the language and hopefully as well provide us additional feedback, because we know this is not a static tool. It's not a perfect tool. We are definitely getting closer to, I think, discipline-specific language that feels right for this group, but we would love to have additional feedback. So if that's one ask from today, if you're interested and you want to dive into this language and give us feedback, there's a form we can link them to that you can actually go into the form and give feedback on the documents. So that's just kind of an overview of what we did with the working group, the kind of overall review of where we are to date. And what we wanted to talk about today is to give folks that update of what we've been doing with this working group, and then talk amongst ourselves about why we think this work is important. Talk to Drew about why he decided to participate in the work. So we do have a set of questions. And if it's okay, Micaela and Greg, we can maybe launch into those questions. I think, Greg, you were going to start off with a few there.
Yeah, I'm happy to do it. Thanks, Erin. And I guess just to make everyone aware of how and why the genesis of all this work, we talked about our incentive and our motivation for engaging here. Why did ADSA decide to collaborate and work on this topic with us?
Yeah, thanks. And that's a great setup question, because I was thinking about it today and it sent me down a total rabbit hole of like how we even met. Like, how did that ever happen? And funny enough, it was Phil Bourne, the dean at the School of Data Science at the University of Virginia, who I know you, Greg, and ORCA have been working with for a number of years. And this was back when you were the director of the Open Research Funders Group and you were undertaking a National Academies Roundtable on aligning incentives for open science. And that roundtable was really around the same concept of developing open science norms and practices for particular disciplines. And I think at the time you were working with psychologists and linguists, but you and Phil both thought that data science would be a natural fit for this work. And I completely agree, and agreed then and I agree now. Having been in the field now for over 10 years, I've kind of witnessed much of the culture around the emergence of data science was happening at the same time and is deeply interwoven with that concurrent emergence of the open science movement. And I think those two are really still very much intertwined. And so the work we're doing now, which is central to your current work at ORCA, is also central to the values and the heart of data science culture and at ADSA. So if you look on our website, we have a mission, vision, value statement. I put the statement about our open science in the chat, but even in our mission, vision, values, we say we believe strongly that working openly and transparently cultivates a trustworthy environment for everyone, from developers to end users to impacted communities. And so really the work that we undertook together was a reflection not just of the values, but our data science communities and their culture as well.
Awesome. Can you share a little bit about the specifics of ADSA's role in the work specifically, and then also how that might serve as a template for the role that professional societies more generally can play with respect to incentive reform?
Yeah, I mean, I think ADSA as a professional association for data science and now AI can serve a couple of purposes here. One is to take on that traditional role of a professional society in steering the norms of the field. And this includes advocating for values of openness and transparency as core to the development of an ethical and responsible field of data science, really. And now, importantly, this kind of work is even more critical as AI is becoming central to our ecosystem and to our members' missions. But I think, secondly, and also maybe equally or more importantly, that beyond advocacy, I think it's critical for professional societies like ADSA to provide the tools and resources to empower its members to embrace open and transparent practices. And I think that's why, to me, this working group was so exciting. It's a reflection of how we can take our values and make them actionable. And so this framework that you and Erin developed, I saw that as having immediate potential application. I think specifically in data science as we think about retention, promotion, and tenure for faculty, because those norms are just now getting established, right? Data science is a field where departments are right now forming, or schools. And so those metrics are still malleable and adaptable, and the norms are not yet set in stone. So there's not that, this is the way it's always been. And so it's really difficult to change against that, especially in academia. There's still room here to modify the practices and adapt them to these value-based systems.
It's really a great point. And I can say from ORCA's perspective, working with other disciplines and other professional societies where the fields do have a longer history, it's very true that some things feel just frozen in amber in a way that data science is not quite as constrained by, which it may feel like things are tough to break open and to change in data science, but relative to other fields, I think you're right, it's an advantage. And actually, speaking of that, just this idea of a field that's rapidly developing and departments and centers and nodes that are emerging, we created this structure where we said we want to try and do this, and we sort of opened the doors to the ADSA community. We didn't know, who would show up or what they would bring to the table. And so maybe, Drew, if I can ask you, why did you decide to engage in the working group, and why does this matter to you and your colleagues?
Well, I'm relatively new to the ADSA community, and so I was looking for a way to engage with the group and participate in. And this working group topic spoke to me because I had seen similar issues in my prior work in engineering education. I used to be an assistant director in an engineering education institute and had similar problems that translate over to data science. But I also think data science being such a multidisciplinary field, there's no single model or formula for a data science faculty member, especially since, my institute's across my university. So I work multi-college, multidisciplinary, and thus have, different approaches, different ways that faculty groups will evaluate their own work and the work of others. And then also, who doesn't like open science? Right? It's one of my passions, and luckily my institute also supports a lot of open science activities and workshops.
Great, and recognize that I've asked a bunch of questions in a row. Erin, you probably have questions too, so I can pass it to you.
I do, thank you. And I think this is following up on some of the threads as well from Micaela. The role of the professional society, again, here, many professional societies are seen as kind of leaders of the discipline, thought leaders of the discipline, norm setting organizations. And many academics look to their professional society for that guidance. And that was kind of our thinking, that kind of name and recognition of the professional society would help faculty in moving this work forward. But I don't know if that's the same way that you thought about it, Drew. So why was it particularly important for you as a data scientist that this group was being co-led by ADSA? And do you think that that'll help you if you decide to take some of this language and try to implement it in the future?
Definitely having an international community behind it helps. If I went to a department head or a dean, I was like, I think this is a great idea. A little smile and nod politely, but coming and saying, hey, this is what a broader community is saying, and having it socialized across the country might also help with a fear of missing out. If I can say, hey, our academic/football rivals might be implementing similar things, it carries more weight. So yeah, just beyond having the great minds that I've got to work with here, having that support and backing is vital.
We haven't thought about football rivals. We're going to have to add that to a framing because I think that's an important one. So how do you imagine using this in your own context? We've talked about the creation of the language with the working group. Something we haven't yet touched on yet is what is the next step? And the next step we're thinking about is now we can start hopefully working one-on-one with members to actually implement some of this language in their hiring, promotion, tenure guidelines at their own institution. So how are you thinking about that? How might you want to use this in your own context? And how do you envision potentially applying this language at your institution?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a little challenging for me because my institute is under the Division of Research, and so we're not a direct academic institution. We're academic institute. So the challenge then is advocating for these things with department heads and deans across the university. But, I also think this is a good opportunity to leverage some of these things to encourage people to engage with us a little more. Part of my job is to broaden and enhance our outreach and engagement across the university, but also externally. And I like to think that similar to how NSF's broader impact requirements also spurred some engagement and outreach, that these types of things will also encourage faculty to work with us on some of these projects.
That's great. And you mentioned too, your place within the institution. And that's something I know we talked a lot about in the working group because people are in different places. Data science is not always embedded in the same place within an institution. So how do you think that will change things if somebody's in an institute versus a department? How might they use this in different ways depending on where they're situated in an institution?
Yeah, that's
That might be too hard. You can always say a pass. It's all right.
that's a perfect question for Micaela to answer.
Micaela,
I
you want to take
actually
that
had
one?
a similar question. I mean, can we envision these metrics and values being adapted for staff, right? A lot of research-based institutes where data science appears on campus is higher technical staff, data scientists, research software engineers, others that you also want to promote and advocate for their working open. So I don't know, Drew, if you hire any folks like that or if you imagine applying that to the people that are in TAMIDs.
Oh, I mean, definitely. I myself don't have a faculty position. I'm a staff member, and we have a lot of faculty that work with us, but we also have our own internal research engineers, staff, and these type of metrics and assessments exist in industry. There's benefits to going out and making connections, but unless you're getting a grant or producing a research paper, there's not much incentive to collaborate. And so things like this, like I said, will help faculty work with us, but also encourage faculty work with other staff, other departments. I think it helps staff advocate for themselves, then also advocate for the work that they do.
That's a great example. So you mentioned collaboration, right? There's a lot of collaboration in data science. And I think actually that's the first value that we worked on together with the working group, because when everybody voted, that was the value that came to the top as a priority for data scientists to talk about how could we better incentivize and value and reward collaboration and partnerships, right? So not just collaborations in your own institutions, but potentially with industry or other institutions or the public or other types of organizations. And I thought it was really interesting. That was the first value that everybody wanted to work on. And probably, I think, continues to be the value where we might have had the most feedback and the most iteration. So that was really great. And you mentioned the interdisciplinary nature of this. And I think that leads me to my next question. Do you think that what we've done so far is unique to data science? I mean, we were very much trying to think about norms and standards for data science as a field, but how do you think this might extend to other disciplines?
That's another great question. I can definitely see taking this to my colleagues in the Engineering Education Institute, ASEE, and taking these types of frameworks abroad. But then also, because I work with a lot of different colleges, it's maybe one of the benefits that they can bring back to other people. It's like, hey, there's more that you can get out of this collaboration than just sheer traditional metrics. Opens a lot of new doors.
Yeah, and I think, you mentioned another field that there are these values that kind of are cross-cutting, right? That matter to a lot of disciplines. And so just to mention a couple other ones we had on the list. So quality and rigor, those are values that matter to a lot of different disciplines, not just data science. We might be thinking about it in a different way for those different, we might measure it or evaluate it in a different way. But hopefully, if you went to any other scientist and said, I care about quality and rigor, they would say the same thing, right? Yeah, right. Fingers crossed. And I think that holds for the other values, just to, in case folks haven't opened up the page, we worked on, as I mentioned, collaboration and partnerships, quality and rigor, openness and transparency. Micaela, as you said, those were kind of key values for us up front. Reproducibility, verifiability, and then accessibility. And folks will see there's some overlap, right, in the kind of different language that we're thinking about, the behaviors. But again, I think those are our values that kind of rose to the top. And we've seen that with some other disciplines we worked with as well, like psychology. We're working with a group in psychology, and a lot of those same values have been important for them as well. Any other questions, Micaela, Greg, that you have, or should we open the floor?
I think let's open it up. We've talked a lot. Let's hear what folks have to say.
I am kind of curious about, you were mentioning the other fields that you and Greg were working with, Erin. Was there a lot of overlapping, the values they wanted to talk about first? And can you say a few words about that?
Yeah, I think we did see a lot of overlap. I think we talked to a group in psychology, we talked to a group in anthropology. those are different disciplines compared to data science, but all of them were sort of concerned about quality. Now, again, quality may mean different things to them, but as disciplines, they were all concerned about quality and rigor. A lot of them were concerned about collaboration and the anthropology, and particularly partnerships with the community. So again, who you're collaborating with and who you're partnering with might be different across disciplines, but we saw that those were important elements for all the folks we talked about. So I think there was that interesting through line that a lot of the values were the same. When you look at the details of how you value those or how you evaluate, that's probably where it'll be different by discipline. So Jake, yeah, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, I think what you just said was a perfect lead up to my question. So I'll just say thanks. This is a really great forum. I was staff at UO for a long time, and I just became tenure track, and we just have a brand new department, and we're just starting to discuss our tenure documents. So this is very timely. And one of the things that I'll say in other service roles I've had at UO, I've seen a lot of our tenure documents, and I've seen a lot of them be very quantitative, 1 point for this, a lot of them be very not quantitative, all these things count. And I think there've been like benefits and drawbacks. But I think one of the main drawbacks of not putting like little point quality in each of these is someone up the chain is all like, well, I really care about bucket A, and you said all the other buckets count, and you did more in bucket C, but that's not good enough for me. So I'm kind of wondering, when you mentioned those details might vary, like for data science, for the things you've heard, do you have an idea of which one of these are the top things? Like if you have this, you're fine, but you might need 3 of these other things, or, is that varying very widely at the moment?
I don't think we know enough is the honest answer, because I don't know that it hasn't been implemented, and certainly hasn't been implemented at scale. It's a really interesting question because there's both inter and intramural considerations, right? So does accessibility count more than quality and rigor? And within accessibility, is it accessibility of your scholarly products versus, educational accessibility of your educational resources? And those are great questions. I will say affirmatively, we have not yet at the ADSA sort of disciplinary level said, or examined what you should care about more relative to something else. I don't know that we will. It's an interesting question. But I do think it really does value by the culture and the values and the history of the individual departments and institutions that are implementing this. We're happy to work with any institution or any department that wants to talk about what this looks like in practice and what the right mix might look like for you. But I don't know that we want to say it should be 13% this, 26% this, 8% that, uniformly across data science, because I think that type of prescription is probably not ultimately that helpful.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, as Greg said, where we're going to start seeing these particular weightings is probably in the institution by institution implementation. So if you're an R1 research intensive university versus a liberal arts college, your weighting might be very different, right? The percentage of time your faculty spend on different things like research or teaching might also be very different. And so your weights would change there. So I think intentionally, we're not being very prescriptive in terms of how those weights break down. I will mention one thing which we really did try to do with this framework is elevate service activities. So we all know that service gets really undervalued. And that's where a lot of the things that correspond to our values are, right? So public engagement or public good or outreach or all of those things that align with some of these values of accessibility or openness and transparency, those tend to get relegated to the service bucket and underappreciated. So we tried to explicitly not say service anywhere and get out of that 3-bucket model and really put those behaviors back in throughout the framework where they correspond to different values and elevate those activities that way. So that was one sort of bias we had. But again, I think it'll vary. Amy, I saw you go on camera. Did you have anything you wanted to add?
Sure, thank you. Years ago when I was at a different institution, I'm at New Mexico State University now, I was involved in this kind of work, but we were using Boyer's model of scholarship as broadly defined. And I was wondering to what extent that informed your view of scholarship. And with what you just said, it aligns perfectly because his model of scholarship is very tied to the public good.
It's great that you mentioned that. I think we actually have that in, I don't know if it's like the first paragraph of our article, because a lot of institutions do depend on that Boyer's model, and they say that they're going by that model. But as you said, he had a focus particularly on if you value something, you have to reward it. And so he was kind of ahead of his time in terms of he was doing a values-based approach in that sense. He just wasn't necessarily calling it that. Yeah. And so I think something that we tried to emphasize there was that if you say you're going by Boyer's model, then you really are taking a values-based approach. And if you're not, then you need to readjust to make sure you actually follow the original thinking behind Boyer's model. So that's what I would say about that. I don't know if Drew, anyone wants to jump in there.
Texas A&M is a land grant university, and so the reason we exist is to help the community. The reason I come into work every day is to help my community of data scientists, both the students and the researchers and the educators. And so, yeah, that definitely came up a lot in our discussions and analysis of this framework.
Sorry, I'm just posting the intro to the paper to validate that actually that is the lead in to the essay that introduces this framework. So happy that we're aligned there, Amy.
And I think it's a great point, Amy, because what we hear a lot from folks is we don't necessarily want to do anything totally new, and we don't want to rip everything down and start from scratch. And so if you can sort of frame this in terms of Boyer's model, which a lot of folks are already using, some folks might feel more comfortable with that and more willing to say, okay, this is not a complete overhaul. It's just going back to the original thinking behind that model.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And yeah, I think this is a model that we were trying to integrate at my last institution. I'm at a land grant institution too. And as I've been here, I'm still relatively new here, but it is so much more integrated, that idea of scholarship, serving the public good. And so this is truly something that I think will resonate with so many institutions in that way of looking at it.
I will say that from our experience, both dealing with rank and file faculty and staff, dealing with department chairs, and dealing with institutional leadership, when you have these conversations and you frame it as Boyer's model or rewarding what you value, there's not a lot of fundamental objection. There's some structural reticence, right? It's hard to change anything, or, course correction on an ocean liner takes a long time. In some ways, those are excuses, right? We're busy. We don't really want to put this at the top of the list. But no one, at least in our experience, no one has fundamentally objected and said, that's a bad idea. So really, we see that as an opening, right? So, okay, no one's objecting if we, quote unquote, do the work. If we make it relatively easy for folks to say yes, we think it's going to be met with a warm audience. And we know it's a small sample size, but like we keep talking about psychology, University of Maryland, Mike Doherty, the psychology department, introduced something very similar. He's our co-author in this paper. And he kept waiting for someone to say, yeah, but you got to put the brakes on. We can't do that. We can't do that. And he found that when he presented at each step, folks said, that sounds good. Like, what can we do? How do we help? And so they just didn't necessarily want to do the roll up your sleeves work. But when it was done, when it was more or less shovel ready, there was not this anticipated objection. Yeah.
And maybe that leads again, Greg, into the two offers that we have for folks today. Again, one is we are happy to work one-on-one with any or all of you. The working group really, I think, is transitioning now from that group work that we did to really socialize these ideas among the group, refine the language, and get to something that we all kind of felt good about. And now going into what do each one of you want to do with this? What does implementation look like for you? And that's the invitation for all of you. We would be happy to jump on calls, brainstorm this with you. If there's a particular way you're thinking about implementing this or using these tools, Greg put our emails in the chat. We're happy to do this. And then again, the second one that Greg already mentioned, but we do have funding for folks who want to actually go and implement something. And it doesn't necessarily have to be this particular framework or all of the language. Just if you have ideas for pushing forward reform at your own institution, this MA3 funding that Greg mentioned at the outset is really for that. Like, could we put some money behind this that will then push folks and have that impetus for change?
Yeah, and I'm really excited when I hear from folks like Jake, where, you guys are just starting and you're developing this department or this unit. It's like a perfect time to be engaging with these kinds of values and metrics because, then there isn't the excuse of steering the ocean liner, right? It's this building it from the ground up is some ways easier.
Yeah, and just Micaela on that, just to come full circle on the conversation here, you mentioned Phil Bourne and him being the introduction for ADSA and us. And Phil started or is the founding dean at the UVA Data Science School. And they just baked this in, right? They really were starting from scratch. And he said, of course, we're going to do this, right? And so I know not all of you are starting up departments, institutes, and centers on the fly. I get that. But it is true that most of you are in programs that are new enough that the cement is probably, it may be poured, but it's probably still wet. So let's get a stick and write our names in it, you know?
That's
I
awesome.
love that.
Love it.
And AI is not letting anybody rest for long, so there's going to be adaptation constantly happening.
And you mentioned at the outset, Micaela, the rebranding that I think a lot of organizations and even universities are sort of rethinking their branding, their framing, their mission statements. It's kind of a time where that seems to be happening. And again, as Greg said, that might be a perfect time to say, hey, if we're reframing, let's go ahead and go all in, right?
Yeah.
Well, I know we're coming up to the end of our time. I don't know if Drew, Micaela, Greg, anyone has closing thoughts or words of encouragement or...
Yeah, I mean, I think this conversation has been helpful for me in how I'm going to try and socialize this with my departments, some of the language and maybe some of my approaches. But I'm also very hopeful because I've been on the other side. I used to work for Texas eGrant with the engagement team, and it was often hard to get the latest science to the community because you can publish it in the journal, blah, 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 but that doesn't get down to the farmer or to the fisherman. So I think all of this will help have broader impacts across the board.
I love that. I love that sentiment, Drew. And it's very apropos. We're all at a pumpkin patch today, so go farmers. All right. Greg, Erin, last nuggets, or should we close it up?
Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you, and thanks to ADSA and all of its members for engaging in this work.
And thank you to ORCA for all your hard work on these frameworks and helping us think about them in the context of data science. I think this is really going to be a great movement forward for the field. So thank you all. Thank you, audience. And hopefully we see you next time at a real fireside chat for winter. Please send us ideas if you have any.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.